Welcome, and thanks for joining us for Atypical Speech and Language Disorders. I'm Jean Mizutani.
And I'm Lori Podvesker, the parent of a 12-year-old child with cerebral palsy and who's mostly nonverbal. And we're here from RCSN.
We created this presentation because we believe that all children, including those with significant speech and language disorders, can communicate. Resources for Children does lots of things, including workshops and webinars on topics like this. Please check out our website. Our address appears at the end of the presentation. Training goals. Think for a moment of the child who brought you to this webinar today. We're going to focus on children that have atypical communication disorders. Atypical communication disorders affects a child's ability to communicate in the typical ways, and it affects just a small number of children. We will help you gain a better understanding of how each child can be supported to be better understood and more engaged with the people around them and their environment. We will talk about considerations when arranging assessments and evaluations, AT services, what they are and how they work, and how AT services tie into your child's education. This workshop runs about 40 minutes, and we will pause occasionally to answer questions. And by the way, please be aware that all chat comments are public. Lori, can you tell us about the different types of communication disorders?
Sure. A communication disorder is an impairment in the ability to receive, send, process, and understand concepts, both verbal and nonverbal, such as graph-symbol systems. Communication disorders can be noticed by the way a child processes hearing, language, speech, and has a wide range in severity from mild to profound. It may be developmental or acquired following an injury or a medical condition, such as an injury to the child's brain before or after birth. People can have one or many communication disorders. Sometimes a communication disorder is secondary to other disabilities or coexist with another disorder. For example, a child may be both autistic and nonverbal. Speech and language disorders affect the way people talk and understand language. They can range from simple sound substitutions to the inability to use speech and language at all. Speech requires a physical ability to produce sounds, and language development requires a child's ability to hear, see, understand, and remember. Hearing disorders are when people do not hear sounds clearly, and their ability to hear may range from faint sound to profound deafness. A hearing test is the first step because language and communication skills don't develop properly if the child is not hearing. Some disorders are secondary to another condition, such as autism or cerebral palsy. Start with your pediatrician first by sharing your concerns.
Thanks. When a child has an involved communication disorder, it can affect all areas of his or her development. We're going to talk about what that looks like in 3 areas. Academic, poor reading and language comprehension. Reading consists of 2 parts, learning to read, decoding, and reading to learn, comprehension. A child with poor language comprehension is likely to struggle with reading comprehension. The ability to hear things correctly is necessary to master the concepts of reading and writing. To write, children have to spell and produce written text. Problems that are present in expressive language, such as vocabulary or sentence structure, will be apparent in written language too. Written language mirrors spoken language. Social development relies on a child's ability to interact with others and is dependent on how effectively he or she can communicate and engage with others. For example, a child who struggles communicating might withdraw from interacting with others because it is just too hard. The lack of experience using language in age-appropriate ways compounds over time. It also affects their ability to understand social rules that we naturally use with language, taking turns, eye contact, understanding jokes. Behavior. Examples of what this looks like. when a child doesn't know when certain behaviors are socially and developmentally acceptable, or a child may not recognize appropriate times for language or vocalization. He or she may substitute behavior for language when they're unable to express their needs or become frustrated because they can't express what they're thinking.
The basic characteristics of a speech disorder vary depending on the type. The American Speech and Hearing Association, also known as ASHA, which is a group made up of professionals, defines a speech impairment as when a person is unable to produce speech sounds correctly or fluently and has problems with his or her voice. Articulation is how we pronounce sounds and words. A child may produce sounds incorrectly, may have a lisp, difficulty producing certain sounds. For example, they may substitute an I for an R. The fluency has to do with the flow of speech, and when it is interrupted by sounds, syllables, and words that are repeated, prolonged, or avoided, there also may be silent blocks or inappropriate breathing, whether it's inhalation or exhalation, or phonation patterns. Think of a person stuttering. Phonological has to do with a person having trouble organizing sounds in his or her mind. And issues with a voice is when a child's voice has an atypical quality to its pitch, sound, or the loudness of when they speak.
A language disorder refers to an impaired ability to understand and/or use words in context. There are different kinds of language impairments. There's expressive, that's difficulty in expressing ideas or needs, or output. There's receptive, that's difficulty in understanding what others are saying, input. And there's mixed, in that case, both expressive and receptive, how we process what comes in and what goes out.
These are some examples of some speech and language communication disorders. A delay is when a child's communication is considered delayed when the child is noticeably behind his or her peers in the acquisition of speech and/or language skills. Sometimes a child will have greater receptive speech, having to do with the extent they understand language, than how they are able to express themselves. Echolalia is when a person repeats sounds that are made by others. This can include words, sentences, or paragraphs heard elsewhere. Often, we will hear young people with echolalia use scripts that they've heard on TV or movies. It also includes individuals talking to themselves, which is known as self-talk. Aphasia is a total or partial loss of the ability to use or understand language, and a difficulty in using words, and is usually the result of a brain injury or a disease like cancer. Apraxia of speech is a motor speech disorder. Sometimes it will be referred to as dyspraxia, and these terms are used interchangeably. This is when the brain has trouble planning to move the body parts that are needed for speech, such as our lips, jaw, tongue. Even though the child knows what he or she wants to say, they struggle getting the words out. Dysarthria is a motor speech disorder that results from impaired movement of the muscles that are used for speech production, including the lips, tongues, vocal folds, and/or diaphragm. It's caused by an injury to the brain. Characteristics of dysarthria are slurred, choppy, or mumbled speech that may be difficult for others to understand, a slow rate of speech or a rapid rate of speech, limited tongue, lip, and jaw movement, and an atypical pitch or rhythm when a person speaks. Also includes changes in the quality of his or her voice and can look like a person sounding hoarse, having a breathy voice, or sounding nasal or stuffy. Nonverbal is when some people have the ability to speak, but not the ability to use language in a meaningful way. Some can't use the spoken language, but are able to communicate in other ways, such as using written or typed language, American Sign Language, or digital communication devices which is something that we'll talk more about later on.
That sounds a lot like your son, Jack. How does he communicate?
Yeah, so Jack is mostly nonverbal. He's 12 and a half, and he communicates in many different ways. Sometimes he gestures. Sometimes he's able to use some signs that he's learned along the way that are approximations of signs, meaning that they're not official ASL signs, but it's his version of them. Similar to when children learn to speak, they may say, da for dad. He also uses an AAC device, which is something that we're going to talk about later on too.
He's pretty amazing, that's for sure.
He's a handful. Hearing loss. These are technical terms, but important for families to know. A conductive hearing loss is when sound is not conducted efficiently through the outer and/or the middle ear, which is caused by diseases or obstruction in these parts of the ear, triggering speech and other sounds to be heard less clearly or to sound muffled. A child may have difficulty processing what they hear, and especially when he or she is in a busy listening environment and with competing noises. Think about a child on the subway with a hearing loss like this and how difficult that could be. It also can affect the way that a child categorizes language. Think of colors, letters, and also sometimes it presents itself with a child misusing tenses, saying a word plural when it's singular, differentiating words and sound, and problems with articulation. A sensory neural hearing loss is caused by damage in the inner ear or nerve pathways to the brain. It can cause trouble hearing certain sounds, misunderstandings of speech, and problems with language going in the ear and out. Therefore, hearing aids are not always a solution. A mixed hearing loss is a combination of both conductive and sensorial neural hearing loss. These losses are those in which the problem occurs both in the outer or middle ear and the inner ear. People with hearing loss can often be helped by using a hearing aid or other amplification devices or even sign language. A central hearing loss results from disorders of the central auditory nervous system and can lead to a child having a central auditory processing disorder. When this occurs, it can mean that a child has lower scores when they take achievement or verbal IQ tests. They may have poor reading and spelling performance, a lower social maturity compared to other children the same age, and requires them to need more help with organization skills in the classroom. Also, it can cause difficulty following multiple step directions because it has to do with how someone processes what they hear, and can lead to a child's refusal to participate in class discussions or other discussions around them because they may withdraw or act sullen.
Some speech disorders are associated with other impairments or disabilities. How involved is the child? First, start with the pediatrician. If there is suspicion that other conditions may exist, evaluations in other areas will be needed. Cognitive. Intellectual abilities have a lot to do with how a person communicates. A child with autism might have poor verbal and nonverbal communication skills, limited conversational abilities, exhibit repetitive or rigid language, echolalia, or speaking in scripts, or monologues. They may also have narrow interests or even exceptional abilities. Physical. Muscular problems may cause difficulty with swallowing and drooling, and sensory issues, such as sensitivity to textures, may cause feeding issues. Over or under sensitivity in a child's mouth is common. Medical, such as genetic differences and syndromes, such as fetal alcohol syndrome, exposure to lead, prematurity, or failure to thrive when born. There are other considerations as well, such as social environmental factors, how a child's immediate surroundings impact their development, both before and after birth. Fortunately, there are many therapies and interventions that can benefit a child Lori, please describe them for us.
Yeah, sure. So these are some of the interventions.
Oops.
Sorry, guys. We're stuck on the slide.
Try it.
Bear with us. We're trying to get to the next slide.
Aha.
Okay. Here we go. We're going to restart. And before I continue, Linda, thank you for pointing out that I mispronounced dysarthria. I misspoke and said dysarthria. So thanks. Work in progress. Okay. So back to therapies and services. Language intervention activities is when a speech therapist, which sometimes parents, we may see a speech therapist title written as a SLP. I find it helpful to share this with other parents because this is something that I found confusing as my son was evaluated and started to get services. Anyway, so this language intervention activities is when a speech therapist interacts with a child by playing and talking, using pictures or books or objects or ongoing events to stimulate language development. Articulation therapy has to do with how a person produces sound. A therapist may model the correct pronunciation of words and syllables during play activities and use repetition exercises to build the child's speech and language skills. The level of play is age appropriate and it's related to the child's specific needs. The therapist may physically show the child how to make certain sounds, such as an R sound, and may demonstrate how the child needs to move his or her tongue to produce these sounds. Oral motor and feeding and swallowing therapy is when a therapist uses a variety of oral exercises, including facial massage and various tongue, lip, and jaw exercises to strengthen the muscles of the mouth. There's also a method called prompt, which if you have time, you should Google because it has to do with strengthening the oral muscles around the mouth. And feeding and swallowing therapy is when a therapist may work with different food textures and temperatures to increase a child's oral awareness during eating and swallowing. For my guy, Jack, the therapist would point out where she was placing the spoon on his tongue, so he developed a sense of awareness. They also used a mirror as they were showing him this for him to see physically how it was done, and also for him to develop a sense of physical awareness when there was food on his chin or he was drooling, to develop that. Assistive technology supports and services range from low-tech to high-tech. Things such as PECS, which some of you with younger children may have heard about, and that stands for Picture Exchange Communication System. PECS utilizes pictures and symbols with text of the image or symbol written below. An augmentative alternative communication, which we also know as AAC, and AAC is all forms of nonverbal communication that we'll talk more about in the next couple of slides. Supports for a child with central auditory processing issues can include an FM unit, which is when the speaker wears a microphone and the child wears headphones, so he or she can directly hear what the speaker is saying, and it reduces the outside and competing noises. There's also a reading intervention program known as Fast for Word, and that targets phonemic awareness, language, memory, attention, and processing and sequence skills.
This is the definition of AT devices and services. That is, this is the definition for AT devices and services in the Federal Special Education Law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the New York State Education Law. Again, this is very technical information. Even I am tripping over it, but it's very important for families to know. They basically divide it into two parts. One is devices, meaning any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially off the shelf, modified or customized, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional abilities of a student with a disability. Services are any services that directly assist a student with a disability in the selection, acquisition, or use of an assistive technology device. Lori, I think many parents are confused about the difference between devices and services. Can you say a few words about how these work together?
Yeah, so the device is the actual technology itself, and that could look like different things. So it could be an iPad with customized programming. It could be a word processor on a computer that a child uses to write. And the services are the support that is given to the child for him or her to use the technology.
Great, thank you.
AT devices, there's a range of supports, and it gets a little tricky because assistive technology exists many ways, and not only to aid communication, but for the purpose of this webinar and topic, we're going to focus only on AT devices in relation to a child communicating. And so low range would be something like PECs, which I described before, and sometimes PECs are used to depict a child's schedule during the day, and this is known as the teach method, to tell social stories using these symbols and pictures. Other low-tech things are word processors, like I just spoke about. When a book has enlarged text, when there are books on tape for a child to hear as opposed to reading, and something known as digitized speech, which is when a child has a piece of technology that records what a speaker is saying, and it gets regurgitated back in writing, in text. And then high-tech devices, are things such as an iPad that I was just describing that has a voice output with the pictures, and that's known as speech generating devices. In between, there are also modifications that a person can use, or accommodations through technology. When a person who has muscular issues and maybe non-ambulatory, they may have some kind of additional accessories that allows them to interact with electronic devices around them. So think of like an eye gaze on a person's computer that allows them to lower the lights, turn up the volume on the TV, answer the phone, and things like that. So AAC has to do with all forms of communication, of all forms of nonverbal communication that are used to express a person's thoughts, needs, wants, and ideas. Unaided communication is something that we all do. Think about how our body language communicates our thoughts or feelings to others, or when we make a face. I'm laughing because sometimes I do this inappropriately. That there's a function to that, and that people with severe speech or language problems rely on this type of communication with their bodies to supplement their existing speech. And aided communication, which is what I've been talking about a little bit, which has to do with the tools or equipment known as augmentative aids, such as the PECs or electronic devices. And something I've learned along the way, which is that when a person uses an AAC device, it doesn't mean that they should stop using the speech they have or working with therapists to increase their speech and language abilities in the traditional ways. So, for example, when a child uses an iPad to communicate that has a touch screen and customized speech and language programs on it, it's to supplement their natural language. And the extent in which they use that device really depends on who the child is and what their abilities are. And the complexity of these devices also depends on the individual child's cognitive and physical abilities.
AT services include evaluation, purchasing, leasing, selecting, designing, programming, fitting, customizing, adapting, maintaining, repairing, or replacing AT devices, coordinating and using other therapies, interventions, or services and devices, and providing direct support to student, family, and school staff. Lori, I know that your son uses an AAC device. What does that look like for you?
That's such a loaded question. So Jack is 12 and started using it when he was about 5 or 6. That's when he first got evaluated. And, you know, we didn't even know that AT existed, and we learned about it from another parent. And it's definitely an ongoing process for us, just as much as it is for him using it. And along the way, I've discovered that there's a real shared responsibility for it between, you know, school staff and us as parents. You know, one of the things we do daily is we charge his device overnight, so when he goes to school the next day, he doesn't have to be sitting next to an outlet, and that he can carry it with him wherever he goes, which is essentially his voice. And, you know, another struggle for us has been the discipline, having the discipline it takes for us to consistently use it to communicate with him, and modeling him using it in others. So engaging in conversations using the device, opposed to, you know, knowing what his utterances are, knowing what his body language is communicating. And it's really, really hard, I have to admit, because my instinct is to not use it because I know what he's trying to say. But if we really want him to use it for the rest of his life and outside of the school and in our community in different environments, we need to model it. So that's something I definitely need to get better at.
That's really hard because you want him communicating with the outside world, not only with you, and it's very easy for your family to communicate with him, but not so outside.
Yeah, and you know, this may sound small, but this is huge. And you know, I think in 5 years from now it'll be a different story. But the voice that his device generates does not mirror his voice in real life. I've read along the way in some listservs that, you know, there are software developers out there right now working on, you know, matching the tone and depth of people's voices so it mirrors the real voices. On one of the programs that we first got, the voice was like a 30-year-old British woman, which doesn't mirror my Brooklyn guy who's 12 whatsoever.
One day, one day. Evaluations. Most families will start with a referral to the Department of Education simply because evaluations are free in New York State. To request an evaluation, parents would submit a written request to a school administrator, such as an assistant principal, special education administrator, principal, or regional committee on special education chairperson, requesting an evaluation for AT services along with the brief explanation why. While the process always starts the same, it's important to note that the Department of Ed evaluation process for AT evaluations could look different depending on where a New York City child goes to school.
Independent evaluations are assessments that are done by people who don't work for the Department of Ed. They don't include diagnoses. So if you suspect your child has a diagnosis, think about where and who you can go to get more information about his or her differences. This can include talking with your child's pediatrician, other parents, reaching out to organizations like us. Can't help but throw a little shout out to RCSN, because this is the kind of stuff that we help parents with one-on-one for free, and connecting them with places who do evaluations like this. And also doing research online. And it can include seeing specialists like a private speech therapist, which again is not paid for by the Department of Ed. Someone as basic as a psychologist or even a neurologist, which can be helpful to rule out things. It may not always lead to a diagnosis, but it's helpful to cross that off your list, a possibility. Other things to think about when seeking out an independent evaluation is the cost of it and how you'll pay for it. Will you pay for it yourself out of pocket? Will your private insurance subsidize that in any way or pay for all of it? Or even if you have public insurance, such as Medicaid, which is great for paying for evaluations like this, and where you'll do this evaluation. There are lots of clinics here in New York City that do this, universities, and also to be mindful of what you hope to get out of this evaluation. Think about why you want to do it and how you're going to use the information that you get. It could be for establishing a baseline. It could be because you're thinking your child may need a different school setting or a different class. Or even if you're going to ask for additional services, having an independent evaluation can be helpful. Also to think about how the results of the evaluation ties into how your child will communicate everywhere, not only at school, but outside of school, such as home and within the community. And, you know, something Jean and I often talk with parents about is not waiting to take the first steps in having an evaluation done, because many times, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate, it's not as easy as we wish it was, even just to get an appointment somewhere. Especially at universities and clinics, there can often be a 3-month waiting time. And if you are planning to use this evaluation at your next IEP meeting, you need to get on it as soon as possible.
We were just talking about the IEP. Evaluation material is used to determine eligibility. If your child is eligible, an individual education program or IEP will be developed and a classification of disability which reflects your child's primary need will be chosen. However, many children have more than one need. For example, a child might be classified with autism, but also have recommendations for speech therapy, an AT device, AT services, and other special education services. The IEP will also include goals, the types of services, the frequency of service, the length, the place of delivery, and even the group size. You'll receive progress notes with report cards and annual IEP meetings, but you don't necessarily have to wait. You can always take the initiative, checking in with teachers and therapists. You can also share strategies and information with the staff about what your child likes in order to incentivize participation. Referring back to Jack, as he's such a great example, your son uses an AAC device. Can you give us an example of one of his IEP goals?
Sure. So if your child gets speech services, on his or IEP will be a dedicated portion that identifies the speech goals. And so similarly, when your child receives AT supports and services, there are specific goals around that service and support. And so for Jack, you know, it changes from year to year based on where he's at. And there are always long-standing goals because of who he is. And an example could be a goal that increases Jack's picture symbol vocabulary to reflect new concept topics and social activities. Also, you know, Jack is 12 and a half, but he's still learning how to read, write, and spell, and so his literacy skills are emerging. And so a goal of his on his IEP this year is for him to use his device to construct a 3 to 5 word sentence. And so it's important that his device is organized in a way that's similar to how he thinks and categorizes things, which is something we talked about earlier. There's a couple of questions that have come up, and Krista and Esther, thank you for your questions. Krista, I'm going to address your question first. Can IEP meetings be requested more than once a year? Yes, yes, yes. And so parents have the right to request an IEP meeting at any time. And this is something that you want to do in writing. And we're more than happy to follow up with you or anybody else to share more information about that process. So please reach out to our resource line, which is the first step, which you'll see the number at the end of the PowerPoint.
Thank you.
So supports and services around AT and other things, in addition to speech and language therapy. Special ed instruction could be modifications that are done to the way that instruction is delivered to a student. It could be when a teacher presents the same curriculum to a child that the teacher presents to the class, but in different ways based on their needs. So it could include the teacher using something that involves a child's sensory, manipulative, visuals, working at the student's pace, presenting one item at a time. It can also include a student being assessed orally as opposed to taking a written test. It could mean modifying the length of assignment. An example of that is for a child with speech and language issues that are involved, a teacher may reduce the reading assignment for this child that they give to the rest of the class, but there is enough text in the reading that will allow the child to answer the same questions that are presented to the entire class. And for testing, for standardized tests, and also for tests, for day-to-day tests. And this is important, people, because this is something that can be written on your child's IEP, that the same accommodations that are made for standardized tests can also be made in the class. However, this will require a lot of work on your part as a parent to communicate with your child's teacher and therapists and possibly administrators to make this happen, because it looks different for every child and looks different in every school. Accommodations have to do with changes made to the child's environment. So it could mean a teacher or therapist sitting near the child when giving instructions, asking the child to repeat back what the teacher or therapist said so they can assess if the child understood the instructions, identifying quiet spaces, reducing physical distractions. For my guy, Jack, they had to put a partition up at certain times because he was so visually and auditorily distracted. Something also as simple as moving a child's desk closer to the teacher. Technology, FM unit, AT, allowing a child to record information, graphic organizers, a calculator, play therapy, turning interactive activities into teachable moments to develop and model appropriate language skills for a child. This could be, singing something. Think about how we all learned the alphabet, reading books, playing games, physical activities. And socialization and social skill groups are when an adult facilitates child-to-child interaction, taking turns, practicing listening skills, developing appropriate language. Often kids with involved communication issues don't know when they should speak and will speak over other people speaking. They don't know that they need to wait. And this has a direct relationship to a child with the way he or she forms relationships, including friendships, whether it's with adults, whether it's romantic relationships later on.
What can you do? At home, you can model language, use simple language and directions. You can sing, read, talk. Stay current on what therapists are doing with your child and try to mirror the same activities. Advocacy is also very important. Attending workshops, webinars, contacting organizations for assistance, and getting more information, or utilizing our resource line. Record keeping. That would mean designating one place to keep all of your paperwork, documenting as many notes as possible on steps you've taken, as well as conversations. community resources, such as connecting with other parents, joining support groups, or joining listservs, and always open lines of communication with therapists and teachers.
So before we conclude, Debbie, I see your question, and I think it's a pretty great question, but I don't really have an answer, and I'm not sure anybody could have an answer. From my experience, this is just my own personal experience. I tried asking that same question to many people, and nobody would really answer, and especially with doctors or therapists, because nobody wanted the liability of saying one thing. And the fact is that, I sound like them, oi, is that, you know, I personally believe in the whole neuroplasticity thing, which means that a child's brain continues to change for many, many years up until they're 20, 25, and even longer. And so it's really hard to tell you or to say that because of A, B, and C, your child will be D, E, and F. You know, there is some scientific background to that stuff, but it's not real scientific a lot of the times. Also, I think to some extent that if you see your child exhibiting these challenges for a while, meaning that there is a gap between their chronological age and developmental age, if you continue to see the same amount of gap as they age, then that's pretty static. And what I mean is that that difference will continue at that same rate for a while until they get older, and or they may hit, you know, a neurological wall in which the gap will grow larger. And also, this is not fear-mongering or trying to scare you whatsoever, is that, you know, the academic rigor gets greater as a child gets older and there's more demands. So I think you should get as much information as possible, and that may include asking for a reevaluation from the Department of Ed and seeking out an independent evaluation. It would be great if you know what, we'll follow up with you. We have your email address.
And don't forget, you're not really going to have outcome predictors available because AT and a lot of the digital technology is relatively new. I mean, it's really been rolling out only over the past recent time. I don't think there is any information about that at that point, but I think there's a lot of promise there. I think outcomes might be better than they were in the past.
Yeah. And so, we're finishing a little early, but before we finish, there was another question. Let's see. Esther asks, is therapeutic listening one of the services? So, Esther, are you asking about the reading intervention program that I mentioned earlier, when a child has a central auditory processing disorder? We were talking about fast for word. I'm not sure if that's what you were asking about. And so I've never seen something on an IEP written as therapeutic listening. Have you, Jean?
I haven't seen anything listed that way, but I have seen speech and language therapy delivered naturally by a pathologist and utilize a program called Fast for Word. So if you look this up, it's the word fast with the number 4 in the middle, word. That is to increase a student's ability to discriminate auditorily. Many kids have difficulties with their auditory discrimination, and that program targets that. We were talking earlier about how communication difficulties could show up later on in reading and writing. So ideally, if a student needed this to increase their auditory discrimination, it would also positively impact their ability to read and write.
Yeah. So before we sign off, Linda, do either of you know the efficacy of fast for word? So scientifically, no, but I actually used to teach middle school kids who are mostly on the spectrum at a non-public school, the School for Language and Communication Development, which used fast for word. And I personally saw it work for some kids, but it also didn't work for every kid. So it really depends on the child and hardwiring, meaning what they're capable, what's within reach, and also the frequency of how often the child has access to this program and the extent in which the results of how they do with it is used to modify instruction. So there's a lot of moving parts. Ah, Linda, thank you. Okay, great.
Thank you, everyone. Keep in touch. We're showing our resource line number on the website. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye now.
Bye-bye.